All right, Mike Maeshiro, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Melody. I'm glad to be here.
Hey, do you know, I just thought you were my first repeat guest.
Ever?
Yeah, you should be on it. I mean, I've been doing the podcast on and off for like 2.5 years now. I've had some big long breaks because it's hard to be a content creator and be consistent, but we're doing it. But yeah, you're my first repeat guest.
Wow, I'm honored. What does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean? Well, I suppose we should probably start with, why don't you give yourself sort of an introduction in your own words of who you are and what you do, just for people that don't know you.
Great. So for those of you who are new, I was a minister and pastor and preacher for years out of a church called Bethel in Redding, California. So if you know about Bethel, you know what that means. If you don't, it doesn't matter. And I was deeply passionate about the gospel and, bringing people to Jesus and mostly like teaching on spiritual intelligence and the gift of discernment and all. That was my world, but I was gay the whole time. And Bethel was publicly, overtly anti-gay. They have an ex-gay ministry. They wouldn't say it that way, but that's what it is. And in 2020, I had this reckoning with the Holy Spirit, and God had been leading me out of the closet for years, and I just didn't want to follow them because I didn't want to lose everything. I didn't want to lose my ministry, my platform, my relationships, my community, my opportunities, my income, all this stuff, right? And eventually in 2020, the straw broke the camel's back and I came out. And so I started doing a lot of work, just pulling apart the theology that I'd known my whole life. I finally started listening to people outside of my evangelical bubble. And I was shocked at what I found. I was shocked at the academics and the studiousness of the research that had been done around why the Bible isn't condemning of queer people. And it was both liberating and infuriating at the same time. Anyway, so the short version is then I came out a couple years later publicly and just took my whole platform and turned it into being a space to advocate for the queer community, especially in response to evangelical homophobia and heterosexism. And I've been doing that for a few years now.
Yeah, and I just caught you saying something. You referred to God as them.
Yeah.
Or they. Tell me about that.
Listen, God was him, Father, my whole life. And the more I pulled apart my theology and my experiences with God, and the more I looked into gender studies, the more inappropriate it felt to gender God as male. Obviously, we live in a male-dominated society, and there's a lot of harm that comes from that. And I think God, the expansive, transcendent divine nature of the God that I conceive of, isn't a man. And I think that the people who told us about God in the Bible, 100% of them were men, right? In a patriarchy world. So, I understand why they would perceive and project onto God that way, but I don't think God is male.
I really want to sort of understand your deconstructing journey and how it's been for you sort of in the last 2 years. 2 years ago we spoke and you were sort of, you'd fleshed your deconstructing journey out. How is that going for you today?
I'm probably not as aggressive about deconstructing at this point. Not that I don't do it anymore, but I was more militant and focused about theology and doctrine and pulling things apart back when we first spoke than I am now. I don't know if my views have changed as much since we last spoke, other than when it comes to being a human being and then living out these values or having let go of a lot of those ideas. I feel more Christian now than I have in a long time, which is interesting. Not in terms of the doctrine or the dogma. I still am happy to not have that in my life and to oppose it every chance I get. But I have this last year, when Trump got shot a guess that was almost a little over a year ago now. And people in my DMs were saying they're sad the person missed and just kind of wishing this man dead and all this stuff. And I am so opposed to Trump and everything that he's doing in the world. But I don't think that killing people is the answer to things. I know. And then the weird thing is there are a lot of people in the world who do think that. And so I made a post hey, I don't love this. I'm not into violence and killing people, whatever. And I got a lot of pushback and people were what are you talking about? Whatever, and that was really disheartening for me. And then a few months ago.
Pushback from the progressive side?
yeah, from my audience. And,
Yeah.
Um,
For not condoning violence. That's
yeah.
so okay.
Yeah. And then a few months ago, I made a post about there was a woman coming out of like a transphobic event. And then there were hecklers who were following her to her car and saying some overtly like horrifying things to her, like kill yourself. They called her, I don't know, like language is probably not, I don't want to, anyway, they were saying some
Turf
directly.
bigot. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, like they were making fun of her weight, telling her to kill herself, wishing that she was dead, that she didn't belong here, that she was worthless, like all this stuff. And I was like, ew, this is not it. Like I am an avid supporter of the trans community. So like, of course, like I'm opposed to transphobia, but this is not the way to address it or to like build a future that any of us want to be part of. So I made a post about that and I lost a ton of followers and got a lot of pushback from the queer community about that. And it just makes me so sad to see this eye for an eye rhetoric still so alive and well in the world. And I had to step back and be like, what is the deal? Because that hits me in a weird, sad place every time it happens. Every once in a while, I'll take a stand and like advocate for nonviolence, and people in my audience don't agree. Not everyone, obviously, but like there's a chunk of people who like chime in and they're like, you're privileged. You can't, the reason you're saying that is because whatever, right? And there's all these reasons to justify why we should be able to, oppress or kill or harm other people.
I'm very familiar with that. It sounds like you've been exposed to the more, icky, for lack of a better word, side of the progressive movement, where it's not so much the ideas aren't bad, it's the mode of delivery. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, well, that person is inadvertently harming trans people, so we should throw things at them. That kind of mentality kind of seems to go against everything we stand for, which is like standing up for the marginalized. Yeah, it's so interesting. I suppose I'm interested in if you could expand a bit more on like what you were feeling when you were getting that pushback and losing those followers, because I mean, they're your audience.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it feels like betrayal. It sounds extreme, but like I felt betrayed. And I wasn't like, oh no, people are not following me. I was like, listen, if this is how you feel and you like are about that life, please unfollow me. Like we are not on the same page. I don't think it's the icky side of the progressive movement. I think it's human. I think it's on both sides. And I think it's throughout any political party. There is a group of people. There's a group of people who genuinely believe that violence or domination at some point becomes necessary or justified. And it is a little bit naive, I think, to come out here and say, no, that's never okay. We shouldn't do that. That's how I feel and what I believe. I recognize there are people in the world who have a different experience and perspective, but I do think that my commitment to nonviolence or pacifism is deeply Christian. It is coming from my like journey with Jesus and recognizing that loving your enemies, forgiving people, turning the other cheek, that whole like ethos is a Christian thing. And I'm like, oh God, no, I've done so much work to like address and confront the harm in Christianity, in evangelicalism specifically. And now here I am like taking hits for being Christian. And so like, that was interesting to like watch this like reconciliation where I'm like having to acknowledge like this is still deeply part of who I am, and something I still value immensely. But yeah, the emotions I felt was betrayal and like loneliness. I felt lonely. Like I feel small and separate and like alone when that experience happens where people want to justify killing or erasing other people.
Yeah, well, what I'm trying to get at is, you're being told by the people you're advocating for. You're sort of being told off by them or lambasted or told you're wrong. Like being told you're wrong for, I don't know, not doing a wrong, if that makes sense. So how did you, moving on, how did you sort of go back into because you're still creating, like what happened after that, after you sort of got lambasted?
Oh, well, I mean, like this wasn't like a big moment. It's happened a few times. So I'm just kind of, I knew before I made that Trump post and before I made that anti-transphobia, the hating on the transphobic person post, I knew for both those, like people aren't going to like this. I knew that was going to happen. But every time I get the volume of pushback or like militant, like aggressive, no, you're wrong, we should kill them kind of vibe, it is always shocking. I don't know why. Like it shocks me that people not only think and believe this, but that like are advocating for it and publicly declaring like, no, this is what we should do. And I'm like, oh God, I don't know you. You don't know me. I don't feel like you belong in my sphere. Like, this is so weird that this is happening right now. So it wasn't like I needed to I might have needed a couple of days to like limp around a little bit, but yeah, that wouldn't deter me from creating content. That's just part of the deal. It's the nature of the playing field. It's how this works. And
yeah, does it make you sort of rethink, the type of stuff you want to put out there though?
Those experiences didn't, but I did have an experience that did make me rethink how/what I put out. A friend of mine who's a pastor in the area that I live in of a progressive church, he had an experience with God a few months ago that he told me about. And when he was telling me about it, I was having an emotional reaction that I didn't want to have. I was like crying and like moved by this, encounter with God is probably how I put that. And I was resistant while being impacted by that. I guess we'd use the word testimony, right? By him sharing that experience, because I don't want to be in a vulnerable position before God again. It's exhausting. It is costly. The last time I was in that level of like, maybe I'd use the word surrender or exposure to the nature of God, it ruined my life. And I don't mean that in a bad way necessarily, right? Like, it made me come out and like everything changed, and that was a lot of difficulty and pain. I don't regret it, but it took a lot of work. And so when I felt this invitation again to be that kind of yielded to the Spirit of God, I was like, no, I don't want this, which is weird to have to acknowledge, because there was a part of me obviously that was like responsive and wooed. But another part of me that's like, God, I know what's down this road. I know what that sacrifice and change brings, and it is exhausting is like my initial reaction, like my defense. I'm like flexing against it, and so I had to like process through that experience and my reaction and like kind of sort through it. And one of the things that came up for me was like, I don't regret the stuff that I've posted over the last several years, but I do think that there's been I'm going to use the word spirit. I don't use that often anymore, but I think it's the right word. There was a spirit of maybe use the word violence. There was a spirit of violence in like how I went about communicating or, expressing myself publicly, that I don't disagree with the things I've said, but there's probably a way that I've gone about it that I'm like, that was there's something harsh and aggressive and violent about the way that I went about it. And I don't think that's wrong or bad to do, but I think if I'm going to incorporate following God in using my voice in the world, I stepped out of how God was leading me to do that and like took things into my own hands to protect myself, and from a place of distrust. And I don't like talking about that dynamic because I don't think my relationship with God should put me in a position of disempowerment. But if you trust anyone, that is kind of anyway. So I'm wrestling through that. And anyway,
it just sounds like you had some self-awareness though. Like, that's really good, right? Or spirit awareness, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, like, no, I think it's tricky because like, if we think about the bigger picture, I'm like, sure, I could change the tone of the things that I say and how I say them so that it's not as abrasive or as pointed. But if I think about the traumatized queer people that I'm making content for, who are responding to and finding advocacy and representation in my stuff, if I remove some of that tone, they lose feeling supported or defended. Not for everyone. Like that's a weird tension I have to navigate. Is like I could become more appealing to a broader audience, but I would feel like I'm abandoning the very specific group of people in the queer community who need clear, explicit communication around the dynamics of religious harm and trauma. So I don't feel like as clean about just like softening the message. I'm like, oh God, I think I needed, and that there are people in the world who need it to be explicit and clear and like unquestioning. Anyway.
Yeah. No. It sounds like a really interesting tension, and probably the kind of tension that people who don't create don't even know about. What is the core message that you are trying to get across to these people?
Yeah. So I'm currently writing a memoir on my Substack called God Made Me Gay. And I'm at a point in the story where
I can't wait to read that.
I'm at a point in my story where like I am at the coming out part, and I am starting to like find voices that are saying things that I was not allowed to hear or listen to. And like someone like Matthew Vines that you and I have in common, like I would not have been allowed to listen to someone like Matthew Vines before this. And so I was at this point in my process where it's like, I'm going to go listen to anybody who's affirming the queer community and listening to what they have to say and considering what they're sharing and seeing if there's any validity in their work. And so it's kind of fresh. The reason I make the content that I do, and my goal, my aim, my mission in all of this is I want to speak to the evangelical, like religious, harmful space that queer people are currently residing in, surviving, making do. Like I spent over 3 decades in that world in my life, and I figured out how to live in that, I would use the word oppressive state of being. I was living in a cognitive dissonant state. I was gaslighting myself constantly in order to fit into that heterosexist community that I was a part of. The culture, it was just layered. Heterosexism was everywhere. There was no space for me to be gay. Like I wasn't allowed to be that way. And it wasn't just like theology or dogma. It was cultural, right? Like it was just riddled throughout everything that I was experiencing and every person that I knew. It was so pervasively heterosexist. And then the theology is a deep underpinning of like divine authority, that this is how it has to be or should be. When I started finding content creators who were saying something else, who loved God, who were biblically trained, who like understood the playing field and were still saying, no, you're valid as a gay person. That was a lifesaver. I needed that when I found it. And it was so helpful for where I was in my process. And I think it accelerated my ability to move forward in my own journey, because it's so arresting. Like even once you like come out to yourself, there's like 1,000 more decisions you have to make about like how you're going to live and who are you and who are you relating to and what does that look like and how are you voting and what do you believe about the Bible and about God. And there's all these, and then like all these micro decisions with these relationships you're in, like it's not just a one-time thing. And so my goal is in creating content is I always want to be speaking for or on behalf of or to the people who are in that place where they don't know yet that they're valid and loved and aligned with the nature of God, just being who they are, because of all of this cultural and theological opposition. And I want to give voice and credibility and like power to their side, their humanity, and permission to be who they are with their faith, and that they don't have to abandon that if they don't want to. Yeah.
I suppose my next question is like, it's hard enough to be a gay person, let alone a gay Christian. I'm sort of interested, what is keeping you committed to Christianity?
Oh God. I mean, part of it is like, it's my native tongue, right? That's the world and framework that I was taught, morality and ethics, to whatever degree that evangelicalism offers ethical consideration. That's how I was raised. So that's my native tongue and conception. I have a deep history with the Bible and like the God that I know, that I was introduced to through the Bible. The God I know is different than the God I see in the Bible, which is unbiblical to say, right? And I don't think that's true. I think that actually in the New Testament, especially, that is what's happening. I think that we're seeing the early church fathers wrestling with a God they're encountering that is different than the God they've been traditionally practicing. This God that accepts everyone, that is leveling the playing field, that doesn't discriminate, that doesn't require all these rules and requirements and sacrifices. Like the rules were changing on a radically fundamental level. We're seeing this right in the early church world. And I feel like that's the truest aspect of what we see in who God has been this whole time, is like there's this continuously unfolding revelation and relationship that humanity has with God, and that we had really strong, specific, rigid ideas about God that we practiced for centuries, millennia, that weren't true, that weren't accurate, that weren't reflecting the nature of God. Like the God that told Israel to go wipe out the Canaanites, every man, woman, child, and beast. I'm like, that God doesn't exist. Yeah, they thought that God told them that, but that God doesn't exist. The God that I know and I'm in a relationship with would never tell anybody to do that. That's not in their nature. It would not come from that person. And so I have just lost what question you asked me why I'm talking about this anymore. But
I asked you sort of why be a Christian? Because it's really hard to be a gay person, let alone a gay Christian. I mean, I can tell, for me, it sounds like what you're saying is you have a deep personal relationship with Jesus, spirit, Christianity, however you want to phrase it. And it's also what you're brought up with. So you kind of can't help it. The Old Testament God and the New Testament God, they almost seem like polar opposites. People say the Old Testament is Christ concealed. The New Testament is Christ revealed. I don't know if I'm just like talking garbage now, but I've heard that a lot.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Well, so here's the thing. I think Pete Enns probably did, from the books that I've read, Pete Enns is a book called The Bible Tells Me So that I think did the best job at lowering, like dropping the understanding down to a more accessible level for the average person in answering that question. And I think ultimately Marcus Borg has a lot of great things to say about this, but I think the short version of this is the Bible is not God's word to us. The Bible is our word about God. It's humans who wrote this stuff down for a long time. The Bible is not God talking to us. The Bible is us talking to ourselves about God. We think God is like this. We believe God said this to us. And I think there are authors who are genuine in what they're saying. They genuinely believe. Whether Abraham actually happened or not, if Abraham was a historic figure and this whole Isaac sacrifice your son situation happened, which I believe someone could have that experience, I bet that experience is genuine. He genuinely believed God told him to sacrifice his son. And would God do that? I have trouble accepting like that a God who's loving whatever would like do that to somebody. But I think what we're seeing is throughout all these, especially Old Testament stories, is humanity is wrestling with their own ethics. Like, what is a God of love like in the world, especially when the world is as violent and tribalistic as it was at the time, as sexist as it was, right? We didn't have any of these words back then, but like, how does God show up and lead us, set us apart in a world like that? I think they were doing the best. The biblical authors of the Old Testament were doing the best they could at answering that question, especially for Israel. I mean, that's the thing that we like don't think about a ton, is like, this was not for the whole world. This is for a specific nation in history and how their God was treating them and how God was leading them. So, I think the God we see in the Old Testament is a constructed one. It's a figment of people's imagination. And I'm not saying the God they're talking about that God doesn't exist. I'm saying their conception of God was skewed by their human experience. And just like my perception of God is skewed today. I think I know God. I know what God's like. But it's based on my limited perspective as a gay man in 2025. There are things about God I don't know now that humanity will probably take for granted 1,000 years from now if we're still around, which I hope that we are, right? Like, I expect that there will be a different, deeper, more refined, expansive understanding of God that's more accurate than we currently have right now, that we can't even conceive of because we're limited by the constructs we've been raised in to think about our social reality. I think that's all true. So when we see the Old Testament, I'm like, yeah, this is cool. We've got like snapshots and historical, like, what's the word? Time capsules of what this group of people thought about God at that time in history. But then when you look at the book of Jonah, that author is proposing something very different about this God than had been presented that thus far in the Old Testament. This God in Jonah is saying, like, what if our enemies, natural enemies in the world, were reconciled to God too? What if our God cares about them too? And Jonah is representing the Israelite prejudice against the Ninevites, right? Like, they're not supposed to repent. They're supposed to be destroyed. That was the traditional, like, how we operate. And Jonah, the book of Jonah, is proposing something different about this God, and it doesn't follow the rest of the flow of the Old Testament up to that point. That is not how Israel thought about God. This was a subversive, fascinating proposal that what if God actually cares about those people also? So we're watching the consciousness of humanity of Israel expand and consider, what if God actually cares about other types of people too? That was radical. And I'm like, that's fascinating. So I think to take these stories and these doctrines or whatever that we're putting on these ancient texts as like authoritative and directional for us or instructional. I'm like, that is very erroneous. They don't know what they're talking about yet. They're figuring it out and they're allowed to. We're putting expectations and demands on their texts that they didn't intend. They weren't trying to tell the rest of humanity how to behave or how to think about or relate to God. They were doing the best they could to make sense of their codes, their morality, their culture, and their deity. And thousands of years later, we're looking at this like, whoa, we have a different story, you know? And it's important that we do. We've grown and evolved and understood the world is not flat. Women are not partially formed men, right? Like, the man doesn't have everything that we need to reproduce and have another human. Like, we've learned a lot about about humanity that they didn't have in the Bible. So anyway, my point is, like, what we're seeing in the Old Testament is their best conception of God, deeply influenced by their limited perspective about humanity and about, you know, like how to care for people and how to run a society or whatever. And so when you see Jesus show up and he's got a very different tune, I think we're seeing an evolved form of consciousness, acknowledging that there's more going on here and that the divine behaves a lot more benevolently and inclusively and radically loving than we've ever been able to conceive of. And I deeply relate to that because when I encountered God at 18 for the first time, I was weeping and beside myself because they were so different from the God that I read about in the Bible. This God that I encountered was incredibly humble and loving. It was shocking to me. They were not on a throne. They were not interested in being worshiped or being, you know, set up on a pedestal and like being called Master, Lord, Father, whatever. This God was scary personal and like deeply committed to humbly serving me. And it was humiliating. It was devastating to experience. I'm like, who are you? You can't be like this. It did not compute. And so the next several experiences I had of God were that on repeat. It was just continuously peeling back this rigid, crusty idea I had about this authoritative, you know, power hungry, like we use the word glory and holiness as like excuses to like turn God into this monarch, leader, authority figure. And I actually don't experience anything like that in God. I don't think that God has interest in power. God is powerful, but God is not interested in power. If anything, God's relationship with power is to give it away. And that's so offensive, especially to people who are committed to an empire or, you know, anyway, sorry. So like we can get lost on this.
No. I like what you're saying. There's a lot in what you said. It sounds to me like you're saying we kind of need to find God for ourselves, but not from a universalist perspective. Like there is some truth somewhere. Like would you agree with that? Like, you know, I always think about that as well. Like I want to know the truth. I never want to use it to exalt myself above others. I mean, Jesus spoke against that in the Bible. I suppose I would wonder, how do we know who's more correct? But then by asking that question, I always think, who reflects the essence of Jesus more?
Yeah. I think if you turn this argument into who has the most accurate data, we're going to get lost because we literally can't prove God.
No, and it's just like that's just appeals to people's like human nature, this desire to be right, which we see a lot of in the, you know, the Christian, the evangelical movement. Yeah, they're more concerned about the rightness of their doctrine, or I would go as far to say they're worshipping the rightness of their own doctrine as opposed to Jesus himself. I suppose you've kind of answered the question then of why be a Christian. It sounds to me like it just brings goodness for you, regardless of the hate or the flack that you receive. Like am I right in saying that?
Yeah, I literally had this thought like 2 days ago. I was like, would it be better for me to identify myself publicly as like spiritual non-religious? I'm not interested in religion. I don't want to do the whole like rites and rituals thing. Here's the rub that I have that I've not reconciled. I think ritual is really helpful and important for humanity. I think we need structure and like practice and rhythm in order to sustain a healthful relationship with our spirituality, to stay connected to it and be impacted by it. So I don't want to just say I don't want religion, because I don't know if that's true. I don't want religion right now. That's absolutely true. I don't want it. But it's not because
neither did Jesus.
But so when it comes to spirituality, like I think when it comes to myth, just how myth plays out in human history, we are obsessed with stories and meaning making. We can't not. Our brains are wired that way. We're going to continue to make connections and find meaning and like impose that onto events and circumstances and people. So that's going to happen. Jesus is obviously a huge, I'm going to use the word myth, not in terms of like fiction, but in terms of like lore and story and narrative that's been passed down for generations. Jesus is a massive myth, especially in America, but in lots of other parts of the world. We're going to gather around myths no matter what we do. We're going to, if for some reason we decided to completely get rid of the Bible and Jesus and it's all gone, humanity would find another thing to gather around. And that might not be as central. There might be a bunch of different types of myths that communities gather around, but it will still happen. So to me, I'm looking at Christianity and I'm like, in the Bible, I still think there's a lot of profound wisdom and beauty and helpful guidance that we still need. And I think that's embarrassing that we still need it. I'm like, we should have evolved by now. We should have learned better and maybe gotten to a point where we didn't need these books to tell us these things anymore, but we don't. There's so many things we still haven't learned. The whole loving your neighbor thing, we still have not figured it out. And the people who are like running around with Jesus on their banner are some of the people who are failing the most at learning how to love their neighbor. Like they don't even know how to love their neighbor. And then when John says, you can't love God whom you've not seen when you hate your brother whom you have seen, right? Like that's not possible. If you hate your brother, you don't know God. And we've got these evangelicals who are happy to hate lots of different kinds of people in the world because of their religion. And yet their sacred book condemns them for that very way of being in the world. And they won't see that. So to me, I see a lot of beauty and value in Christianity, but not the Christianity that's like mainstream pop culture American evangelicalism. Like there's so much about that I think is so toxic and ignorant and inaccurate in how it relates to the Bible. But if we're not talking that, then I'm like, oh God, I think Christianity has a lot of beauty and profundity to bring to the table and has so deeply impacted the human psyche in important ways. So, and I still value that. I don't know.
I always try emphasize Jesus as opposed to Christianity or religion. I don't know if that helps. Like I think people do need some sort of foundation or like you said, structure to ground their faith. But I don't know if I would ever do away with calling it not God or Jesus or whatever. I mean, I do have a theory about is Jesus just one way to God? I'm in Vietnam at the moment, and Buddhism is huge over here, and they're trying to get to enlightenment, and I'm like, who am I to say that they have the wrong belief? Like, are we both just using our beliefs as conduits to access the God? Moving on, though, how would you like to see the evangelical church change? Because it's one thing to call people out, right? Or call the church out. But I feel like when you do that, you want to hold them accountable, but it kind of just entrenches them more in their beliefs.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I have no interest in persuading the evangelical church to change. I don't think that's going to happen.
That's understandable.
I drew a line in the sand and I chose the people who were being harmed by evangelicalism. I was like, I want to be with you. Because I see Jesus doing that. I don't see Jesus hanging out with the evangelicals, going to the evangelical church, participating in that whole system. I do think Jesus would radically be offensive and upsetting to that whole system. But if you're going to ask me that question, what I would like to see change in the evangelical church is, firstly, I think there needs to be a massive, widespread movement of mourning in the evangelical church, of acknowledging grievous harm that they've participated in for a long time now. There needs to be a repentance, which would bring this necessary sorrow. You cannot submit to the Spirit of God and recognize the ways that you have actually hurt God, been part of harming Christ in the world, and not fall on your face weeping in sorrow for how, because I had to go through that when I came out. Part of the reason I came out when I did, the way that I did, was because I recognized the ways that I was complicit with a harmful system that was dehumanizing queer people for a long time, and I was benefiting from that system. And I said yes and turned a blind eye to all that horrible stuff because I was benefiting. What hypocrisy, what cowardice. That was so not okay. And I wept for a few months. It just being so sad and sorry and ashamed of having been willing to live like that because I benefited from it. It was so selfish and not okay. The evangelical church needs to do that in terms of how they obviously harm the queer community, how they harm women, how they harm men, but in a different way, right? How they hurt people, how they harm people of other religions. how they've like participated in politics. I'm talking America right now, but like there's so much that the evangelical church is guilty of. There's blood on the evangelical church's hand. I'm not trying to be dramatic, but like the evangelical church has been instrumental in causing real death and harm in people's lives, which is crazy to think about because that's not the example of the church we see in the Bible. But the example of like evangelicalism today is nothing like what we see in the Bible. They don't behave that way. There is not this brotherly charity, this sacrificial love, this preferring those in the margins. Like they're not doing that. So I think there needs to be this huge, like if we're going to call it a revival, like the church I was part of, they were often like constantly looking for revival. And I'm like, hey, you want revival? I think it's here. It doesn't look the way you want it to. You guys, you want to participate, you need to repent. You need to weep, like tear off whatever you're wearing and put on that sackcloth and ashes and to cover yourself in soot and weep and wail before God. This would be a biblical example, right, of repenting. Like put yourself in the dirt and like be grieved. What you've done is so awful. And then from there, from a broken spirit of recognizing that you have been incredibly instrumental in harm, then the next step would be like a radical stance of humility in learning, listening to queer people, to people of color, listening to people in the market, letting them share their perspective, their pain, the harm that's been done to them for a long time. And then they would do the thing that they know how to do so well and create classes and learn how to embrace, dare I use the word diversity, and embrace their people, right? And like become educated about what it means to participate in equity when the table is not level to begin with. And so when it comes to addressing like harm or like ways that things have not worked out for like justice, there's some extra effort that needs to be put in to compensate for how already disadvantaged certain people groups are in this conversation. Like the church should be leading in those things and should be the most informed, and they are like one of the biggest violators of this. And then God, we can keep going.
Do you know what? Like as I hear you talking, I'm like, yeah. I mean, part of me says that sounds like wishful thinking, but then the other part of me thinks like, well, I actually think the only way that's going to happen is by treating them with more compassion than they treat us with. Hey man, you got to call me. Like maybe that's wishful thinking, but I just think people listen to you when they don't feel judged, right?
Yeah.
But it's hard. It would take a lot. I mean, maybe it would take a lot of Jesus. I don't know, but that's just what I'm thinking as I hear you speak.
If you're thinking strategically, how do we change their minds? Like I would be, if that was my goal, my platform would look very differently, and I'd be saying very different things. If my goal was to change the mind of the evangelical, I'd be saying things very differently.
Well, you kind of I just want to, you kind of hope that anyone would just want to not change the mind of an evangelical, but sort of change or reshape people's understanding of what being a Christian is. And it's not this following the Bible, like a set of moral instructions, or not being gay, not having sex before marriage, all that bullshit. Yes, that stuff has caused gay people a lot of harm. But yeah, it's not about changing their minds. It's reshaping our culture's understanding of, what Christianity actually is. And I think to do that, they would need to be shown compassion. But maybe not everyone wants to do that, which is also fine. But yeah, I understand what you're saying about your platform. It's more of a healing space.
Well, it's prioritizing and centering the queer community and the queer experience. But also the evangelicals don't hold title Christian. Like they're a sect of Christianity.
Yeah.
So we don't need to get them to change or be something different in order to redefine Christianity for the world, you know? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a very ambitious goal. I find your distinction, like I'm in Australia, but a lot of my audience is US, UK. When you say evangelical, I'm thinking you're meaning like more fundamentalist, deep South Christian. Is that what you're meaning? And you've kind of merged the two? Because when I meet evangelicals, I'm just thinking of like Hillsong people that are like sort of don't really know what they, or is just sort of just going along with the doctrine they've been taught. I mean, most of them are pretty happy, clappy people that believe homosexuality is a sin or whatever. I suppose I'm saying that really lightly. I see them as more victims of a doctrine as opposed to perpetuating any harm. What would you say about that? Because it's indirect. if they are perpetuating harm, it is indirect. It's not as overt as the fundamentalist types, right?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but the people you're talking about, the Hillsong clapping people, you're giving them a benefit of the doubt. What?
Sorry, I think I said happy clappy, and I'm like just laughing at what I said. The Hillsong happy clappy. Carry on. So and you're right, I am giving the benefit of the doubt because I do feel a conviction, but it's like, how do you give them the benefit of the doubt while also holding them accountable?
Well, the thing is, like, I think you're giving them a benefit of the doubt and assuming the best about them. But the reality is, if they were operating in the empathy that Jesus demonstrates in Scripture, if they were actually like submissive to the nature of the spirit of the Bible and the nature of God, that empathy would require them to recognize that what's happening to queer people in the church especially isn't okay. And then they wouldn't be okay with just passively permitting that kind of oppression in their theology or their practices. And they are guilty of being detached from, desensitized to, disconnected from that very real necessary empathy that marks a follower of Christ. And so I would say, I think you're right. It's coming from a place of naivete or ignorance or indifference. But I mean, the Bible has stuff to say about people who are like on the fence about things. The Bible's very clear about what it looks like to follow Jesus and represent the kingdom in the world. The religion that James says the religion the Father accepts is to look after orphans and widows. And that isn't literal orphans and literal widows. It was at the time. But that means people who have been pushed to the margins by the systems we created, the victims we've created based on our socioeconomic and religious structures that dehumanize people. The religion God cares about, honors, values, is the one that runs after those people and takes care of them. That includes queer people. That includes immigrants. That includes women. Like, God, women are so... Anyway, so like that we have too much understanding now about what human rights are and what people deserve for people like a Hillsong happy clappy person to not know that and still participate in a system that seeks to keep those people subjugated. I don't think it's as innocent as that's framed. Like, they're accountable for that, whether they're conscious of it or not. It doesn't change the fact that they're actually responsible to know better.
Yeah, okay. I see what you're saying. I want to know what you kind of think, because you do talk on your platform a lot about harm. You know, there's harm and stuff. And I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit, I wouldn't call myself, I'm more into, personal responsibility, having a bit of a victor mentality, even though, I've been treated with a lot of, contempt in the church for, being gay. I don't know why my mentality has sort of gone that way. I suppose my next question is like, what do you think about platforming people that have these quote unquote harmful views and trying to just have a conversation with them? Like, do you see any usefulness in that type of dialogue or not?
I see usefulness in it, but something I see as more impactful than the usefulness is sending a message to people, like especially queer people. If you're performing somebody whose message is harmful to queer people, you're telling queer people, hey, I'm going to bring people who aren't safe into my platform and give them a voice, give them space to share their message that is harmful to you. And new people will probably hear this harmful message. And so I think the message that's being sent in that scenario is, I'm not safe, more than let's have constructive dialogue with people like this. Now, if it's
I just want to be a bit blunt here, Mike. I mean, you kind of make it sound like people need to be wrapped up in a blanket a little bit. Like, it's, we can't, like, not everything needs to be harmful. Do you know what I mean? Like, we should be able to have these conversations. There seems to be a lot of coddling, not necessarily from you, and sorry if I was a bit blunt, wrapped up in a blanket, whatever, but just in these progressive spaces, which, you said earlier in the podcast, you've experienced, this attitude from them. And I'm like, well, where's the line?
Melody, listen, this is important talk. So when you said you tend to have more of a victor mentality, I think this is a huge rift between, I don't know what people group and what other people group, because I don't think it's just queer people and straight people or like left and right. I think it sits somewhere else. But I get that rhetoric, and I was raised in a world that taught me to not be a victim, that I'm not a victim, right? And all this stuff. And that there's truth to that somewhere. I get that. I appreciate that somewhere. But the problem is what gets lost is that priority to be a victor or to not admit victimhood or not acknowledge or validate victimhood actually prevents people from being able to grieve properly. It removes the opportunity to actually feel the devastating pain of being dehumanized for decades in your life and being told that you're nasty and evil and that your inherent nature is deplorable and that you don't belong in the. That is psychologically damaging. It might not be physical harm, but it is psychological harm.
Which is often worse than physical harm, but that can be overcome, right? If grieved properly.
Here's the thing. I don't think overcome is the right word for that scenario.
Okay.
That has to be healed. It's not something you overcome or conquer or dominate. It is something that you heal and like rightly relate to and understand correctly. And then from that sense of healing, an empowered, victorious embodiment can happen. But if we bypass the grieving and the healing that needs to take place from allowing that pain to be felt and owned and touched by the person who experienced it, that person can never be a victor. They can act like a victor and have a victor mantra that comes out of their mouth, but their emotional capacity to actually face pain and hold the pain of other people is radically immature and stunted. And I think I see a lot of that on the toxic positive side of this stuff where victimhood isn't allowed to be acknowledged or expressed or felt. I think we're actually bypassing a very real part of a human journey. And if we're going to talk about sin in the Bible, I think ultimately the most accurate form of sin we can actually point to in modern day thinking today is trauma. It's the result of unhealed, unprocessed, unrecognized trauma that creates implicit biases and prejudices that we then only have violence and domination and retaliation as our coping mechanisms to face things that make us uncomfortable or trigger us or like incite stuff in ourselves that we don't want to face. And so when we host people on our shows who are running around embodying this stunted, emotionally disconnected, harmful, oppressive, dominating persona in the world, I don't think we're having intelligent dialogue. I think we're actually validating, yeah, we don't need to heal. Let's let people who don't heal have their opinions and their influence, and let's keep treating that like it's a way of being in the world. And I don't think that that's valid.
Okay. So I interviewed a guy named David Bennett, who you know, obviously.
I don't know him personally, but I know of him, yeah.
Well, you know of him. You know, I've hung out with him. I think he's a great guy. I disagree with, you know, being a celibate Christian. Like, that's his conviction, and I respect that. Obviously, my conviction is, yeah, like, I can have lesbian sex and have a relationship with Jesus. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Yeah, I'm just going to say it like that. Like, that's, you know, this is what I believe. You can believe that. You believe that. Like, and I suppose my goal or message is just to say, yep, like, here I am. Here it is. Not necessarily. I mean, maybe I guess, yeah, maybe I am trying to let people know, yeah, it's okay. You can do both. I suppose I'm just trying to find the differentiation between you and I, because I don't see a problem with platforming someone like David. Like, he's just got a different view. He's not out there overtly harming anyone. He's just like, this is my conviction. This is how I live. Talk to me about that. Talk to me about your thoughts on that.
Well, let me ask you this. Did you go through any conversion therapy in your journey?
Like clinical, like going to a psychologist and being like,
yeah, that or
I mean, I don't know, like it seems quite broad. I mean, most people's understanding of conversion therapy would be like going to like a camp in America, or like going to a psychologist who said, hey, like, are you sure? Like, yeah, there's been many, I never went to a camp, or I never went to a officially gay conversion psychologist or whatever. But yeah, there were a lot of, I went to an all Christian school.
Okay.
And there were a lot of voices saying, hey, like, this isn't how God made you. This is blah, 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 blah. I mean, I'm sure we could compare stories, but.
Well, and then my goal isn't to compare. It's more just like wanting to see what exposure and experience you have to that realm.
Mm-hmm.
So like I spent some years going through conversion therapy with certain counselors at Bethel and certain ministries and whatever. To put yourself in a position to be influenced by a counselor or a therapist, whatever, in that context, not therapist, that's not the right word, like a counselor or whatever. is an incredibly vulnerable position to choose to be in already, right? Like you're making yourself susceptible to their influence and their input and like to guide you through this very scary, already demonized part of yourself. And when the message there is, you are fundamentally wrong, we have to figure out how to change you. The goal is being a heterosexual. The goal is making you straight. And here's all the ways that your actual wiring is wrong and where it probably came from. And they start to put these ideas in your head that you were molested as a child or sexually abused or like whatever. They have all these like really strange, unfounded theories about why gay people exist or why the condition of being gay is a psychological like disorder.
Yeah. Like there's 8 different reasons or something. Yeah. I went through
so
that.
They're like deeply indoctrinating you with these ideas. And when you are genuinely trying to heal, and these are the healers you're working with, you embrace and internalize this way of being in the world that you're like, I'm bad. And then these desires, if you have any kind of sexual inclination, let alone actually follow through with it and have sexual experiences with another person of the same sex, obviously, like there's all this shame and there's a lot of repression that comes from this. And it's deeply seated in you at like fundamental places of your being. And so when that's the context, when I've lived through that, survived it, and had to like do a ton of work to recover from that, and then I work with people who are also vulnerably, painfully like limping through their lives because of the damage this has done to them. And then you see someone like, what's his name? David Bennett?
David Bennett, yeah.
Yeah, you hear something like that get out there publicly affirming a lifestyle choice that is hailing from this notion that who you are or what you're like in the world is fundamentally contrary to what God wants for people. And it's hitting on that same note. Those people are uniquely susceptible to a message like that. And this is an alternative. It's another closet for them to live in, to make space for and normalize that internalized homophobia. I don't expect everyone to understand that, but every person who survived conversion therapy, who's not still trying to make that work, would recognize a message like that is radically harmful because of already how psychologically how you've eroded psychologically under that kind of influence for however long that it's been. A message like David's is not liberation or freedom or affirmation for queer people. It's a less hidden closet. It's still a subjugated life. It's not freedom for them.
It sounds like you're saying it could be even worse than being overtly anti-gay.
I don't know if I'd say it's worse. I'd say it's tricky and messy and scary and confusing for people in that position because they're already fractured. People who have been through conversion therapy are already like riddled with confusion and exhaustion and pain. And so then for David's message to come in and say, hey, yeah, this part of you actually is flawed. Here's how you can cope with it better and still follow Jesus or whatever. And they're still repressed. Like it actually circumvents the whole healing process, the whole self-love, acceptance, alignment with them, and then with my journey and conviction of who I know God to be, I can't support a message like David's. That's literally the opposite of what I heard from God. I'm going to oppose it. I'm like, this isn't God.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I must be, maybe I haven't interrogated that enough. I think I have some type of predisposition to just want to talk to people, regardless of their views.
Listen, I think talking to people is a great idea. That's one. I have people in my life who I vehemently disagree with, and I think their beliefs can be very harmful. I'll talk to them. I'm just not putting them on my platform. That's the difference.
Yeah, and maybe my platform's a little bit different to yours anyway.
Yeah, and maybe your goal is different. That's different. But like if I were working with queer people who are vulnerable, I would probably not steer them toward your show because of that. And that's not a personal.
It sounds like you're undermining. I feel like that undermines, people's ability to cope. Because we can hear views that we don't like. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's personal again, but yeah, if you were saying you're not going to direct someone to a platform that's earnestly seeking the truth and conversation and goodness, maybe there's are some harmful views, but it's just like, I think people are strong or can be strong. They can cope. We're not made of cotton wool, but I don't know. I haven't lived what you've lived through. So maybe it's hard to say when you talk about conversion therapy. Maybe I want to understand that a bit more. Like, is it counseling sessions where they've actually tried to convert you? Or is it, because what you're saying, what people have said to you is, yeah, it sounds similar. to my experience. I just never went through. I don't think I went through therapy session. I must have. Maybe I need to. I mean, it all kind of felt a bit like, oh, what is the reason? You know, it is dehumanizing. I mean, I'm with you on that. And yes, I've had experience similar to that. But I mean, look where I'm at now. I kind of want the same for people in that respect. Maybe we've just gone different in a different. We want the same goal, just a different way to get there. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not saying you can't or should or whatever with your platform. Do what you want. I'm just acknowledging when it comes to like the exposure I have to the experience, but then also the people I work with of recovering from living that way, I would never subject them to a voice like David. Not helpful. It's the opposite of helpful. It's taking them in a direction that is not good for them. And whoever is over here being like, well, this is valid, this is whatever. I'm like, yeah, it's because you don't get it.
What voices would you, like, other than yours, maybe direct people to?
Specifically for like recovering from harm in the church as a queer person?
I think so, yeah.
I'd send people to Stan Mitchell, Kathy Baldock, Colby Martin, Kevin Garcia. Let's see, who else? There's some voices that don't create content anymore, so I'm like, oh, not them.
I'll try to put what you've said in the show notes as well to direct people. But I suppose I'm happy to sort of wrap this up now, Mike. Yeah. What's next for you? What is next for you? You're writing a Substack. God made you gay, which I'm very excited. Like, yeah.
I don't have plans for this yet. I'm not like actively working on this yet, but I do think the next big thing I'm going to work on is probably a book. I don't want to do a book yet, but I think that's probably going to end up having to happen. The nature of it, how it's going to go, I'm not sure yet. I'm toying with a couple ideas, but that's like the next bigger thing that I'm looking at. I'm like, I'm probably going to do this. I've started doing a little more speaking, which is fun. I miss doing that. So that's kind of coming up. This Substack is a big thing I've been doing it for a year and a half now. And I think within this next year, I'll probably finish this story. Then the rest is all just continuing to do what I've been doing. Yeah, it's that.
Yeah, cool, man. Well, I'll put all your stuff in the show notes. And I really appreciate you, coming on my platform to have a chat with me for the second time. Hopefully there'll be a third. Hopefully you'll talk to me again after that. You're undermining people. Yeah. And I appreciate it.
I am not saying you shouldn't do what you're doing. I'm just advocating for this psychological framework for queer people recovering from these ideas. It's deep. It is delicate. I'm not saying you shouldn't have people like David on your show. I'm like, that's great. That's a choice you make. I just would then acknowledge your show is unsafe for queer people recovering from all this. It's not safe for them.
Yeah.
Now there are other queer people who it might be great for, and they're in that place where I just want to think about it. Let's just like entertain these ideas. Like, fine, that's a liberty they get to take. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying in the work that I do, it's not safe for people who are in that place to like be entertaining those ideas because they are susceptible to reverting back to their own shit. Anyway, so don't hear that I'm like, what you're doing is bad and wrong. You shouldn't do it. I'm saying for the context of the world and the people that I'm working with, that would be deemed unsafe for them because of where they are in their lives. And that's a very specific group of people, you know?
Yeah, it sounds like a specific group of people that I don't know if it's just because we're different in different areas geographically. Yeah. I don't know, man. This seems like a very American thing, this whole... I mean, not saying there are people... I mean, a lot of gay Christian Aussies that I've met haven't been through that, you know? So maybe it is. I don't know. I respect what you're doing, and yeah, like I said, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much
and the
for
one
coming
question
on.
I want to like throw in there as we land this plane is, what if we normalized empathy and compassion, not sucking it up and getting over it? What if the normal was empathy and compassion? Could we be a society that works that way, or why is that the thing we have to overcome or get away from? Why is it people need to just suck it up? Why is that the normal?
Well, who's saying suck it up though? No one's. I'm certainly not saying that.
We're gonna listen to messages that are hurtful. Like, just suck it up. Be a bigger. Like the message is like, get over it. Be a bigger person. It's not being coddled.
Yeah, I don't know if that's my language. The language that I used was like, we are capable. I think I want to put more onus on the person. You know, we are capable. We can grow a backbone. We can hear views that we don't like, and still, yeah. I think maybe you've misconstrued what I said. Yeah, definitely not saying suck it up, toughen up, facts don't care about your feelings.
Okay, well, for the record, people in this part of the world hear some of that and it comes across like that. That's how it translates. It's like, you just need to suck it up. Right? I know that's not what you said, but that is kind of how it comes. Anyway.
From your perspective, and maybe some of the people you're talking about, yeah, sure. But I don't know. I think, yeah, I get what you're saying. I think people should take responsibility for what they say, but I'm not responsible for how people misinterpret what I say, right? But like, I'll take what you say on board. I'm not, I'm open-minded. Look at us. This is great. I'll leave it. All right, I'm gonna leave it there. But
nice.
Thank you for having a good faith.
It was an honor to be a repeat guest.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye. Don't go anywhere.